Okay, economic standing of animals. You probably sensed, if you got a chance to look at the paper, that this is something that we're real interested in, but something that we're newbies at. And so this is really the first paper in this area that we have produced. So anyway, we'll just start with the big issue. Do animals count in economics? And I use count in this in sort of the traditional sense that I take from Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. So in utilitarianism, Mill mentions what he called Bentham's dictum. Bentham actually never called it Bentham's dictum, and for that matter, it's kind of hard to find it in Bentham. But Bentham's dictum: everybody to count for one, nobody for more than one. Oh yeah, tomorrow is Mill's 215th birthday. And the notion there was these guys are greatest happiness people. They want to efficiency for them is maximizing the size of the happiness pie, the sum, the net benefit of pleasure over pain, if you like. Basically, Mill tells us and Bentham tells us that they would include all sentient beings. That is, the non-human population should be counted as well. And Mill's quite explicit about that. And of course, Bentham is quite famous for his footnote that talks about that. So they both think that animals should count. Nevertheless, in standard economics today, animals don't count. And it's not just, when I say it's not just like, oh, if you're doing a cost-benefit analysis of a new something or other, that you don't survey the animals and ask them how they feel about it. It's true that humans care about animals and that there are various protections in there, but in terms of directly counting in the social cost benefit analysis, they don't count. They do not fall within the standard of Bentham's dictum that everybody is to count for one and nobody for more than one. Animals directly count for zero. And by the way, it's really not just about cost benefit analysis. If you look through I think introductory textbooks, animals are not treated like humans. This quarter I teach law and economics, and of course many of the examples that are used, cases that have in the past, involve animals. A famous property case in the United States, early property case that every law student reads, it concerns somebody who's hunting a fox, and somebody else comes and captures and kills the fox and takes it, even though the fox was being pursued by these hunters, and the issue was who owns the fox. But these cases are never, look at the point. Imagine if animals counted, right? This would not be a property case. This would be a murder case. This would be a criminal law case. So it's really quite, it's just sort of taken for granted in some sense that animals don't count. So we want to challenge that a little bit, and we're not the first, of course, to think about that. So we want to say, what if we were to grant animals standing in social cost benefit analyses? And there are various ways of doing that. And the first one here is the status quo, essentially, that animals, we count through human interest in animals. And we know that people spend a lot of money on their pets and they lavish them sometimes with all sorts of attention. And we know that people care about other elements of animal welfare, and they care about endangered species and that sort of stuff. So there's a significant human interest in animal welfare. But nevertheless, this kind of status quo view is that when you're thinking about what makes for a good policy, you will take into account the human interest in animal welfare, but not the animal interest in animal welfare. Okay. Another possibility, and this is one that is what people tell you basically when you ask them directly. If you say, animals suffer, humans suffer. And a lot of the things that we do create suffering for animals. They also create suffering for humans. Is animal suffering as important as human suffering? And it's very common for humans to respond to that by saying animal suffering counts, but, and the but is it doesn't count as much as human suffering. So that's a standard thing. We are using this kind of legal notion, legal terminology of the idea of standing, where it's already been applied to cost-benefit analysis. So we're not the first to do this. But the general approach, as I'm sure all of you know, is that if you have standing, then you just count like everybody else, or you don't have standing, then you don't count at all. And it is possible, however, of course, to think about something that's intermediate, where you count, but you don't, in the Bentham sense, count for one. You count for 1/10 or 1/20 or 1/2. Okay. And then, of course, the third possibility is that animals count for one, essentially. And I say human equivalent in some sense here. Well, anyway, that's you probably can hear the kind of reflection of Peter Singer in this, the notion that that we should have sort of equal consideration of animal interest as with human interest, which doesn't mean that animals and humans have the same interest, but that suffering by animals and suffering from that when suffering occurs, how you feel about it should be independent of the species in which that suffering takes place. Now, if the different quantities of suffering, then it's a different story. Okay. All right, so that's the sort of thing. So now let's imagine we're going to introduce animals into social cost benefit analysis. We might be interested in how many animals we're talking about. So this was from a U.S. Department of Agriculture sort of snapshot one day. This was the stock of livestock, if you like, farm livestock. These particular ones. There's others actually. I didn't put all the numbers in there. But on essentially at an instant in the year 2017, if you were to take a census of animals that were farm animals that were alive in the United States at that time, what you would find is they greatly outnumber people by something like 7, by a factor of 7 to 8 here. And this is, again, not all the farmed animals that are out there. And the big players in this game, this 2.3 billion animals alive at any one time in 2017 in the US, are the chickens. And poultry more generally, but the chickens, with it, including the hens and the pullets, are a full 2 billion of that. They're and hence, in terms of numbers, just numbers of animals, land animals, I should be careful, of land animals, chickens predominate. So if what you care about is minimizing suffering of animals in this world, at least in this US, but it's true largely in the world, then with respect to land animals, at least you should start with the chickens. Assuming everything else equal with respect to suffering, but not everything else is equal with respect to suffering. But it's not just land animals. As I said, we'll take another look at the scope of what's going on here. Every day in the world, something like 200 million land animals are killed, 200 million every day killed. And the fish are, I'm in the public policy department. We have a lot of students, thankfully, who are very interested in trying to make the world a better place and minimize suffering. And if that's what you want to do, starting with the fish, there's a lot to be said for starting with the fish, because the numbers are amazing. 1 trillion a year, up to 3 trillion, depending on various estimates. Lots and lots of marine animals killed. A lot of them, the shrimp, are killed in huge numbers. Anyway, so the point of all this is this kind of almost dwarfs humanity, actually, in terms of the numbers. These are big numbers. So now, if you're going to give these guys standing, you're not giving standing to, in a cost benefit analysis, some sort of small inconsequential population. They may be inconsequential, but they're not small. They're very, very big. Okay, so what this means is, I just basically said that even if they only count, to take the partial standing, even if they only count as 1 in 100, they still outnumber humans. They're the big players in this game. Okay, I won't go into details. There's a little short section in the paper about the kind of standard farm animal welfare conditions in the United States. In some ways, the conditions are pretty good. And in some ways they're horrific. And generally, when you get to see the smuggled out video of what's going on in these concentrated animal feeding operations, it is essentially a horror film. Anyway, most animals, the vast majority, are in concentrated animal feed operations. Again, this is dominated by chickens and turkeys, but it's dominated by chickens. There's so many chickens, and the percentage of them that are in these CAFOs is so large that it dominates the picture. What are the problems with CAFOs? Huge crowded animals, just one right after another. It can vary just how close this confinement is, and then they can't do anything. They can just kind of sit there and maybe fight with each other because they're so crowded, and because of that they get subjected to things like debeaking or other types of surgeries, tail docking in the case of pigs, which is quite painful. A beak is not like a fingernail or hair. It is a very sensitive organ, and they do it without anesthesia. So anyway, you have these kind of I think we say in the paper, we basically say that they're not happy places for animals, these CAFOs, and so I'll leave it at that at this point. And you basically can't do anything. The restrictions on natural behaviors. Hens really like to nest. Pigs really like to root in dirt. We know this from experiments and for that matter, just watching. And that stuff, by and large, is not allowed within CAFOs. And there are these 2 cases of close confinement. If we added veal calves, we would probably add, that would be a clear third one. Battery cages for hens, so little cages, one stacked on top of another, and of course kind of football length field of these things, and row after row as well. And within a small basket of these things, maybe 5 or 6 chickens, that's where they spend their essentially their whole life for these hens. Gestation crates for sows are for months around. It turns out, I think it's easy to remember right now. I'm worried that I'll get it wrong, but having just said it's easy to remember. A sow is gestates or is pregnant for, I believe, 3 months and 3 weeks and 3 days. That's the average time. That's why it's easy to remember how long it takes for piglets to get born. And for months around that, it's standard in many places, including in the U.S., that sows are stuck in a basically 2 feet wide by less than 7 feet long crate, just so-called gestation crates, where they can't even turn around, much less do anything else. Okay, so those are some of the ones that are particularly worrisome. Okay, so what happens then, now that we've seen a little bit about the conditions under which animals are kept? What would happen if we gave animals standing? Well, the problem with giving animals standing in terms of changing things is they are impecunious. They do not have much in the way of money. But of course, that's endogenous to the story, right? They don't have standing legally, they don't have standing economically, and that's why they don't have any funds, right? If they could actually sue for harms that were done to them, if they had legal standing in that sense, they would collect money, and then they wouldn't be impecunious. So nonetheless, the way the world is now, they have a low or zero ability to pay. So if you said to animals, hey, if we're doing a cost-benefit analysis of improving animal welfare by getting rid of close confinement, giving them more space, that's going to be costly to humans. It's going to be very valuable for the welfare of the animals, but they can't pay for it. They can't compensate the losers, as it were. And so those sorts of things wouldn't happen. So animals can't buy their way out of bad conditions, but at the same time, it's hard to compensate them if you make their conditions worse. So if it's determined that for profit maximization reasons that we should make those battery cages even more crowded or do something else that undermines the living conditions of animals, how are we going to compensate the animals? Give them better feed, maybe, but that's expensive too. So it's not like this is some sort of theorem that I'm presenting, obviously, but it sure looks like that when you add full standing to animals. And I included partial standing here because the claim on partial standing is because of the numbers of animals, it might as well be full standing. That improvements from the for animal welfare from the status quo would not survive a cost-benefit analysis because animals can't pay for them, and that deteriorations would not survive cost-benefit analysis because animals can't be compensated. Now, there might be some circumstances in which they could be compensated, but that's so again, not a theorem, but a suggestion. So we get this sort of status quo bias. Changes in either direction are hard to pass, at least the standard version of a Caldor-Hicks test. But I just want to point out that animals didn't always live in these CAFOs. They grew up in other ways. The CAFOs, the horrific conditions of CAFOs were not the situation 50 years ago for animals. In some ways, as I said, CAFOs are good with respect to animal welfare. They get fed well, they get protected against predators. I shouldn't say they get fed well, I'll say they generally don't go hungry. So we got to the point where we are through a bunch of changes that have compromised animal welfare, among other things, and of course we're uncompensated. Those changes themselves wouldn't have got there. This status quo, which has such kind of gravity in the current situation with respect to how movements away from it are hard to pass cost-benefit analysis. That was true when the world was better. Some of you might be intimately familiar with agriculture, and I am certainly not. And I have to say, my understanding of farms, I had, for the Americans here, you might be used to, I had a Wizard of Oz view of animal agriculture, because at the beginning when they're in Kansas, they got the little happy family around, they have a few pigs and chickens, and it's also bucolic and nice, and that's just not the way it is for 99% of the animals in the United States, and I would say in the world as well. Okay. So that's if you had full or partial standing. It's hard to get away from the status quo, but we don't have full or partial standing. As I said, the usual situation in economics is to say that we don't count animals directly, but of course humans care about animals, and so there's indirect interest. And then the question becomes, okay, well, if we're talking about efficiency, we want to see if the human preferences are being adequately served, and those human preferences including animal welfare. So we asked the question, is it possible that the current status of animal welfare in the US is inefficient from the point of view of humans only? Are we really maximizing the size of the pie when the only people who count are humans with respect to the treatment of animals? And the argument that we're going to make is we're going to say probably not. That basically that even if the only thing, the only entry in the social cost benefit analysis is from humans, that animals don't receive the good enough treatment. Why is this? So there's two arguments here. One is that people just don't know. People have no, do you know when you purchase meat at a grocery store, the living conditions of the animal that provided that meat? Most people have close to no idea, and actually many of them are not particularly interested in learning because they suspect or have evidence to believe that it will create a cognitive dissonance for them. So people have no idea. And even if you knew at the grocery store, when you go to how about when you go to a restaurant and you have meat, do you have any idea what that animal was like? People just don't know that, right? There's also the impotency story. This is, well, what if you did know it? You're a small player in this game. How is your behavior going to change anything with respect to these billions of animals and the quality of their life? And the answer is it isn't, and people recognize that, right? And so for these reasons, a sort of latent interest in animal welfare might not get reflected in especially, I would say, in the economic marketplace when you're at the grocery store. Now, then there's the political marketplace when there's a referendum about trying to provide better animal welfare, where maybe you don't feel so impotent anymore in the sense that other people are taking part in this, and of course the probability that you're pivotal in the election will be small, but you may well vote and there's lots of evidence that people do, you may well vote for policies that improve the welfare for animals, even though in your own daily life with your purchase decisions, you show very little in terms of willingness to pay for better animal welfare. There's a lot going on in the animal agriculture world. There's big subsidies. Those subsidies, many of them are not directly to animal welfare, but they are to plants. And in particular, they're to corn and soybeans. And in the case of soybeans, most of them are planted to feed to animals in the United States. And in the case of corn, it's not a majority because of ethanol, but most corn in the United States, of course, is not designed for human consumption. And most of it goes to animal consumption and to ethanol. And there's big subsidies in this area, and there's other subsidies directly to animal livestock. There's the environmental effects associated with these CAFOs and the greenhouse gas emissions with respect to cattle are particularly get a lot of attention, but kind of local pollution of waterways is common around CAFOs, and of course smells and air pollution and all sorts of stuff. And then there's two things that we learned that are serious standard externalities. One is that animals are given a lot of antibiotics. The majority of the antibiotics consumed in the United States are consumed by farm animals, and they build up resistance. And that resistance travels from animals to humans. So humans can end up with diseases that could have been treated by antibiotics, but they're resistant to those antibiotics because of the use of antibiotics for animals. And the other one is zoonoses. Of course, we're in the middle of a pandemic, which is believed to have been transferred from animals to humans. And the conditions under which animals are brought up make the potential for zoonoses quite great. There's this huge crowding. There's thousands and thousands of animals right next to each other. So it doesn't take much for a disease that affects one to affect all, and all sorts. There's also mixing of species at times. Anyway, we've had lots of bird flus, for instance, and others that have are diseases that start with animals, but then wreak havoc on humans as well. Classic externality: we do not ask that animal agriculture pay for those. So we get too much animal agriculture from a social point of view, is the claim here. Again, even if we don't count the animals directly. Then there's internalities. I won't spend any time on that. That's just the notion that basically most people in the United States probably eat more meat than is good for them. They would probably be healthier if they cut back, especially on red meat and processed meats like bacon and stuff like that. But that's not an externality. It might be an internality. They might not understand how bad it is, or they might be subject to present bias or something that would cause them to systematically underestimate the future health costs that they will face because of their consumption of meat. Okay, so those are some reasons, though, to believe that basically there's too much animal agriculture, and that animal welfare is underprovided within animal agriculture. We look a little bit, I mean, we're going into great detail, about two possible policies that have been bruited about a little bit. One is to apply a tax on meat. If animals have full standing, you can't tax it high enough. That is, a tax is equivalent to a prohibition of CAFOs. And again, even with partial standing, I would say that that's the case. That's because the externalities are just too great. However, if they don't have standing, then what you do to animals is not an externality with respect to the animals. And then you have to ask, well, what about essentially the fact that animal agriculture is currently subsidized? It's subsidized directly, it's subsidized indirectly, and it is subsidized by the fact that there are externalities that are associated with it, environmental and health, as we've just talked about, that are not currently are not taken into account, or not. There's no mechanism or only a very limited mechanism to take those into account. So meat taxes might make sense even if you don't care about animals because of these existing externalities. Meat taxes are not, if what you care about is animal welfare, meat taxes are an indirect instrument, right? You could say, let's get better animal welfare. What a meat tax does is it says, let's have less meat. And that can be good with respect to total amount of animal suffering, but it does not push the producers of meat in the direction of better animal welfare for the animals that remain. What Sabina and I suggest is we suggest that since one of the problems that leads to a suboptimal provision of animal welfare, even if animals don't count in the social cost benefit analysis, is that people have bad information, is to let's make sure people get better information. So what we're suggesting is that if you have a meat tax, we'll, as your producer, we're gonna apply a meat tax to you, but we will cut the rate of that tax, say, by 50% if you provide full webcam 24-hour coverage of the areas in which you keep animals and where animals and humans meet. Some farms have done this on a voluntary basis, but by and large, that's not the way it works. For the most part, it's what happens inside CAFOs is closely held secret. So we want to incentivize better information, and then we could feel better about the economic and political marketplaces operating in such a way as to produce something that is, efficient, even if animals don't count, efficient from the point of view of animals. So that's what we're up to there with meat taxes, and we basically say the same thing with respect to getting rid of gestation crates or getting rid of battery cages. That let's pass rules like California did years ago to get rid of battery cages, for instance. But it takes a while. Usually, when these passes laws, there's like the existing farmers get years before they have to adjust. So one thing we could do is we could pass such a rule. It is expensive for farmers to adjust to it. So if you want longer time, you can buy it. But if you want to buy the longer time, you have to put in the web cameras. Okay, so that's sort of the idea. So again, let's try to overcome the lack of information and what again seems to be from the side of both many producers and many consumers a kind of interest to avoid that information. How much should animals count? Should they count like humans? Full Peter Singer, Jeremy Bentham. Should they count partially, one pig or 100 pigs equals one human, or should they only count with respect to how humans count them? I don't know the answer. Nobody knows the answer. We certainly don't have a consensus on this issue. Okay, but of course the notion that we end the paper with is this uncertainty doesn't mean that okay, we're just going to stick with the status quo. It means that there's some chance that the right answer is that animals have full standing. And if that's the case, what is going on with respect to animal husbandry in the US and in the world is a massive crime. I have a quote there from Bertrand Russell. He had his birthday yesterday. I think it's important to start with John Stuart Mill and to finish with Bertrand Russell, because I think many of you might know this, but it's not always a well-known fact. Bertrand Russell was literally, he not only was a philosopher who followed in Mill's footsteps, but he was literally John Stuart Mill's godson. Okay, that's all. Oh yeah, there's that, but thanks everybody.
Thank you. Felipe, I have you down as the discussant.
Yes, you cannot start screen while other. Okay. Yeah, I'll just wait for Jim to.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks. So okay, I'll go full screen here. Excellent. Can everybody see the slides? Okay, excellent. So thanks a lot. I'm going to be discussing Jim's paper on the economic standing of animals. Overall, I believe it was a quite interesting reading. Let me just briefly summarize here the general idea. I mean, for me, being well, a discussion from the point of view of political economy, where basically the key interest is to account for animal standing in standard welfare or cost-benefit analysis that informs farming policy. The research question from here being at the end of the day, well, how sensible are the implications derived from standard cost-benefit analysis in farming policy to basically varying degrees of animal standing, okay? And for me, the key message from this paper being, of course, well, enhancing animal standing in traditional cost-benefit analysis could potentially preclude actual policies from passing an augmented cost-benefit analysis, which to some extent seems evident, considering that we're increasing the costs, the social costs of the policy, while keeping, of course, the benefits, the social benefits untouched, okay? So these are the key ideas for me. I only have two comments that I believe could make the paper even more interesting. So the first one is related to a question that's at the heart of the paper, and it's related to, well, how to make more rigorous, how to make rigorous sense of animal standing in standard welfare analysis. Or put differently, I believe the paper could be made even more interesting if it could be framed along the line, how can you augment traditional approaches of welfare analysis from public econ literature to account for what you're actually calling animal standing. Okay, we already know that the literature proposes, several approaches to do this. If you, for example, take the structural approach, it would be very interesting to see a future iteration of this paper that could actually tackle questions like, can you develop a model that actually rationalizes what you mean with animal standing in cost-benefit analysis? And if you could do this, could you estimate or calibrate parameters in order to quantify these welfare effects between a business as usual setup when there's no policy in place and a policy setting when there's a specific, farming policy in place that assigns some degree of animal standing to incumbents? If alternatively you chose a reduced form approach, could you, for example, sensibly identify exogenous variation in the data to isolate basically how individuals in the economy value animal standing for some specific setup? I'm saying this at the end of the day because I believe it would be ideal to frame the discussion of the paper along these lines, and this would be because it gets the paper's message across to an economic audience that's ultimately interested in the key, economic mechanisms behind your research question, okay? So that's pretty much my first comment. My second comment is related to something that you said almost at the end of the talk, and it's related to the question of what do negative externalities to animals mean in this setup, which is the scenario that you call animals having basically full standing or human equivalent standing. So in order to make my point here, I'm going to extract an example from the paper. Suppose animals possess, as you say, human equivalent standing in farming policy cost-benefit analysis. The paper proposes that then operation of meat, egg, and other, farming activities as dairy industries would then be negative externalities as animals are not participants in a mutually beneficial exchange, okay? And then the derived implication from this line of thought being, well, a Pigouvian tax in this setup to de-incentivize farming would be prohibitive. And this would be the case given the massive external damages to incumbents, which in this case are animals, and factory farming would essentially be ruled out of the economy, okay? And I'm saying this because I had quite a hard time wrapping up my mind around this idea, because negative externalities at the end of the day, what they are costs posed on incumbents, in this case animals, by some third party in such a way, and this is the essential part, that is not channeled through the price mechanism. And I say that I had a hard time wrapping up my mind around this idea because it's hard to think of a setup where animals voluntarily engage in Pareto efficient trade, so that what you call externalities is not simply something that happens by design, okay? So I believe this goes back to my first comment, again, related to the fact of that it would be very interesting to see future iteration of this paper framed either along the lines of building a framework that make sense in traditional welfare analysis of what animal standing means, or either thinking about identifying key exogenous variation in the data that would help you isolate the willingness to pay of individuals to access consumption produced under a farming policy setup that assigns some level of animal standing to incumbents, which in this case are, of course, animals. So this would be pretty much it. Thanks a lot for listening. I believe this was an interesting read, of course.
Thank you, Felipe. Jim, you have 2 minutes if you would like to respond. If you could
Well,
hear me.
yeah, I got it. Thank you. It took me a second to unmute there. Thanks so much, Felipe. A close read and anyway, great points. I like the way you encapsulated the paper. Might even consider trying to, in future iterations, change it in ways that will reflect what you've had to say. So thanks for that. You're right about an economic audience. Of course, this paper is not going to satisfy in its current form it's not suitable in this form for a professional economic journal, essentially. I would say, and I don't know whether that. I'm not sure where we'll go from here, and so maybe the direction would be policy journals instead of economics journals. But since I think this is going to turn into a long-term research area for us, we'll certainly want to be able to speak more directly to economists than the current paper does. I think that the last point you made, I think it's really important, but I'm not 100% sure of that. I understood your point, but I think that, well, anyway. So your point there is that what I didn't understand is how these things that we call negative externalities, if animals have standing, that how we can differentiate them from this what am I trying to say, from just arriving at them by design. I didn't, that's the thing that kind of threw me about the by design. So I guess that's my question. If you can make that clearer for me.
Leon, do we have time for a quick discussion on this?
Yes.
Yeah. 2 minutes. Okay. I mean, I'm going to be very brief. Yes. I mean, the only thing I mean with this is that I mean the notion of externalities is a notion of basically incomplete markets. So it applies to settings where there are, individuals that are voluntarily engaging in hopefully efficient trade. And to the extent that there's some reason that precludes them from doing this, then we can think about negative externalities. But it's very hard to, of course, to think about negative externalities in this context with animals, which will, of course, not, I mean, it just doesn't make sense to think about animals voluntarily engaging in efficient trade. And to the extent that that happens, it's very hard to think about negative externalities to animals. I understand you're trying to make the point of, agricultural and farming practices being exerting damage to animals. I just wouldn't frame them as negative externalities, because then I believe you're running into a very tight spot where, we're used to think about externalities as something that arises from inefficient trade, which is not something that we usually think for animals, right? That's what I meant with, these kind of situations where animals face damages from farming practices being something that happens by design. Okay, and that's pretty much my answer.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Felipe. Really appreciate it.
Can I just make a very brief comment? I will be very fast. Following Felipe's suggestion regarding the model development, if you are not able to quantify these welfare effects and even animal welfare, I think this is an opportunity to apply a game theory approach in which you don't necessarily need to quantify welfare, but you can try to measure the effects and different incentives different agents can have in the model. You can have either consumers, producers, regulation, but in the way that, because you cannot quantify necessarily the animal welfare, you can at least try to see different changes in incentives. So that would be my suggestion.
Felipe, I have you next on
Yeah.
cap and trade versus taxes. So the
Yeah.
floor is yours.
Okay, yeah, I'll just stop sharing. I'll share my slides. Presentation, okay. Excuse me. Okay. Presentation. Yeah. Excellent. Can everyone see the slides? Okay, so thanks a lot for listening, for being here. Today I'm going to be presenting my paper on the cap and trade versus carbon taxes debate, and I'm going to be specifically focusing on the efficiency implications of emissions price volatility in the power sector. Okay, so just so that you know, what I'll be presenting here will only be it's going to be the key analytical result of the paper. I'll be, for purposes, even for a half an hour presentation, it would be impossible to cover the quantitative experiment along with the results. So I'll be restricting the attention to the key analytical conclusion that I delivered in the paper, and that's what I sent to Jim as a discussant as well. So just so that you have that on the back of your minds. Okay, so let's begin first by acknowledging that there's strong consensus that carbon pricing in the power sector should definitely be at the heart of emission reduction efforts, even more in, you know, the economics profession, of course. And in this sense, conventional wisdom has traditionally held carbon taxes and cap and trade policies as equivalent. However, this conventional wisdom is out there, even though there's also theoretical guidance indicating several dimensions along which price and quantity-based regulation differ in terms of welfare outcomes. And one example of this, of course, is Weitzman's 1974 seminal paper, Prices versus Quantities, where he basically shows that information deficits on the regulator side about firms' marginal abatement costs actually matter for differences in welfare outcomes, where welfare costs arise basically because the regulator is not able to set either the price or the quantity instruments in such a way that they equate marginal benefits with the exposed marginal costs of abatement. Okay, and this is the argument on which most of the literature on this topic has been traditionally focused on. Okay, so in this paper, I'm going to show you a different narrative. I'm going to show you that aggregate uncertainty about emissions prices under a permit system are going to matter as well for these efficiency differences. So notice that this will not be a story about information asymmetries. This will be a story about how aggregate uncertainty in the economy is going to matter, okay, for these efficiency differences. All agents in my setup will have symmetric information. The only thing is that they will not know everything, okay? That's where the uncertainty will kick in. And I'm going to be very specific about how this is going to happen, okay? So in this paper, I will analyze ex-ante welfare differences between cap and trade and carbon taxes in competitive electricity markets. This is my research question. What are going to be the key economic mechanisms going on? Well, under cap and trade, under a permit system, aggregate uncertainty in the form of shocks to aggregate power demand will map into allowance price volatility. And this will happen because shock realizations will update firms' expectations about their individual emissions at the expiration date of the policy's current compliance period. Therefore, it's going to be the collective action of firms simultaneously adjusting in competitive equilibrium their allowance holdings as this uncertainty unfolds, what will be driving both current and future permit prices. You see, and this is going to be important because it's this endogenous volatility in allowance prices what will be providing differentiated distorting incentives to output decisions throughout time. Notice that the story is very different under a carbon tax because it's distorting incentive to output decisions. The per unit carbon tax is certain and independent from aggregate uncertainty, from the history of shocks. Okay. So what I'm going to be doing here is that I'll begin by developing a competitive equilibrium model of the electricity sector, okay, that I will later on extend to incorporate counterfactual analysis of carbon taxes and cap and trade. For the cap and trade setup, this will of course require modeling of an additional permit market, where firms validate their emissions at the expiration date of the current compliance period. Okay, and firms will do so by engaging in trading and banking of permits in an allowance market, as it happens in real-world examples, as the European Union Cap and Trade Program or the California Cap and Trade Program for emissions, for example. Okay. And lastly, as an application, which I will not be talking about the results here, I will quantitatively compare emissions equivalent policies on welfare grounds. And I'm going to be doing this by calibrating the model parameters using data on the universe of ERCOT firms and power consumption to match key empirical moments from the data. Okay, ERCOT being the regional transmission organization that supplies roughly 90% of Texas electricity market. And once I've done this, I will simulate the shocks to power demand and solve the model first under a business as usual setup when there's no policy in place, and then look at how welfare effects would be under a carbon tax setup and under a permit system scenario. Okay. So there are three contributions that I'd like to highlight from this paper. Number one, this paper provides a first competitive equilibrium model of the electricity market that integrates supply side frictions as ramping costs and capacity limits at the unit level with non-storable output, while also factoring in aggregate uncertainty arising from demand shocks and analysis of competitive equilibrium effects of carbon taxes and cap and trade, all while still preserving analytical tractability. Okay. Secondly, this paper provides a theory of endogenous allowance price formation that is consistent with standard asset pricing theory and Hoteling's rule in expectation. Okay. And thirdly, this paper shows that aggregate demand uncertainty will be a fundamental source of efficiency differences between control modes. And it's in this way where this paper departs from information asymmetry narratives present in previous Weitzman style studies. Okay. So model big picture, I'll be accounting for competitive firms that will own multiple power plants, which will differ under energy types. Ramping cost, there will be ramping costs and upper capacity limits at the power plant level. I will also be allowing for heterogeneity in production costs and capacity limits at the unit level across energy types and firms as well. Moreover, aggregate uncertainty will be in the form of period by period shocks to power demand. I will elaborate on this soon. And I'll be assuming that installed capacity at the unit level and plant ownership is exogenous. Okay. So let me elaborate a little bit more on how I'll be modeling uncertainty in this setup. Okay, I'll begin by specifying a constant price elasticity power demand function where dt represents consumption at time t, pt is the electricity price at time t, beta is the constant price elasticity of demand, and z will be the random variable representing the demand shock. Okay, such that ZT is then the realization of the shock at time t. Cap C will be the state space for this demand shock, and pi will be the degree 1 Markov process regulating the demand shock throughout time. Okay, this is basically how am I modeling aggregate uncertainty in this framework. So firm building blocks, the firms will earn profits at the unit level for producing electricity and selling it in the market. Okay, therefore operating profits for any firm S at time t in plant I will be plant level revenues less production costs less an adjustment cost, which will be capturing the ramping costs that I commented 2 slides ago at the power plant level. Okay, so YITS will be the output of plant I of firm S in period t. CIS is a parameter representing the cost of producing a unit of output at plant I of firm S, and alpha IS will be a technological adjustment cost parameter regulating basically the level of these ramping costs. As I said before, there will also be capacity limits at the unit level so that production is non-negative and cannot exceed an upper bound YIS max, which will be representing the nameplate capacity at plant I of firm S. Okay. So having said this, we can look at the firm's profit maximization problem in a business as usual setup when there's no sort of carbon pricing policy. In this setup, the firm will choose a sequence of feasible contingent production plans to maximize the expected discounted present value of profits. That's pretty much put differently, choosing the sequence of contingent production plans to in such a way to maximizing the discounted present value of revenues, less production costs, less ramping costs, subject to those contingent production plans being technologically feasible. Okay, that's what the power producer is doing in a business as usual setup. Notice that under a carbon tax, things are going to be a bit different because a carbon tax increases marginal costs at the unit level of fossil fuel power plants. So that if before the policy, a fossil fuel unit had a marginal cost of CIS, then after the policy, it will have a marginal cost of CIS plus an effective tax given by tau, the per unit carbon tax, which is a dollar amount per ton of carbon emissions times an emissions rate, okay, which will be regulating how much emissions I get from producing an additional megawatt hour at power plant I, okay, and everything else is exactly the same as in the firm's problem under a business as usual setup, okay. Now the story is very different under a cap and trade because a permit system introduces an additional decision in the firm's profit maximization problem, which is how much allowances to carry from period to period, okay? So under a cap and trade, the firm will choose a the sequence of contingent production plans and allowance holdings in order to maximize the discounted expected present value of profits. That's pretty much the same as saying maximizing the discounted expected present value of revenues, less production costs, less ramping costs, less the value of the stream of permits acquired, subject to, of course, the technological constraint. Production plans must be technologically feasible, and also an environmental compliance condition requiring the firm to have enough allowances at the expiration date of the policy's compliance period to cover all emissions generated throughout, okay? That's the firm's problem under a cap and trade, okay? So of course, by now you may be thinking, okay, how are you exactly gonna take a stance on efficiency differences? What's the welfare measure that you're actually gonna be using? In order to address this question, let's first define VS as the expected discounted value to the firm. That is the expected discounted value of profits at the optimal production plans, okay? Therefore, the relevant measure of welfare in this setup will be basically the aggregate value to firms. That's pretty much capturing producer surplus in a dynamic setup, plus the expected consumer surplus, plus the expected climate change benefits, which are going to be the benefits of emissions avoided at the social cost of carbon due to the carbon policy in place. Okay, and this is the welfare measure. Okay. So with this, we can now establish analytically why welfare outcomes will be different across control modes. Okay. So I'm not going to go into the details of the algebra, but I show in the paper that allowance price and firm production dynamics in equilibrium will satisfy the following condition, which for purposes of ease of exposition, let's interpret for the case of interior solutions at the power plant level, which is the case where we have the equality. Okay, so what this condition is saying is the left-hand side, the expected marginal profits of producing an additional megawatt hour at this power plant must be equal to the right-hand side to the expected environmental costs to the firm under the policy. Okay. Notice that the analogous condition under carbon taxes is going to be similar. The left-hand side is going to be exactly the same. What's going to be different is the right-hand side. The difference is that the right-hand side will be certain. It will depend on the per unit carbon tax. Okay. Meanwhile, the right-hand side, in the case of a permit system, it's going to be stochastic. It's going to depend on today's expectation about allowance prices at the expiration date. You see? So it's going to be uncertain, it's going to be stochastic, and it's going to be updated as uncertainty unfolds throughout time. And this is what explains why output dynamics are going to differ across policies. Basically, the environmental costs to the firm under the policy are going to be different across policies. You see, this is going to induce different output dynamics across policies, and with this also emissions dynamics, because emissions at the end will depend on production at fossil fuel units. You see, so this is pretty much the reason why welfare outcomes will be different. Okay, according to the welfare measure that I presented you in the last slide. So let me just be more concrete on this. For the comparison, set the emissions cap M under the permit system and the per unit carbon tax tau for the carbon tax system to make both policies emissions equivalent from a point of view of expectation. This is in order to make a fair comparison across both policies. So basically a higher right-hand side, a higher expected environmental cost to the firm under the policy will imply the following trade-off. Of course, lower output at plant level interior solutions, but also lower probability of hitting the plant level maximum capacity. We're making basically production more costly because that now we have an environmental cost to producing at fossil fuel units, and the same higher probability of temporal shutdown at these high marginal cost natural gas units. The costs of these are, of course, will lower within period firm profits and consumer surplus. We're producing less and we're making production more costly. The benefits, of course, are higher climate change benefits. We're reducing emissions by making production at fossil fuel units more costly. Okay. So this goes back to what I was saying you before, the efficiency differences between equivalent carbon taxes and cap and trade. We boiled down to comparing these endogenous dynamics of today's expectation about allowance prices at the expiration date relative to the predetermined and certain per unit carbon tax. This will induce different output dynamics and emission dynamics across policies, which will ultimately be driving the efficiency differences according to the welfare measure that I showed you before, which is value of firms plus expected consumer surplus plus expected climate change benefits. And that would be pretty much it. Thanks a lot for listening. I'd be happy to have any questions or comments.
Thank you. Jim, would you like to discuss the paper?
Yes, thank you. I will try to share a screen here, which always seems to take me longer than is appropriate, really. Okay.
Well, it took me a bit of time, so we're on the same page there.
It's always, yeah, it's awkward when you do that. Felipe, thanks so much. That was a really clear. This for me is a difficult paper, but that was a very clear presentation of what for me is a difficult paper. So I got a lot out of it. Thank you. The introduction was well motivated. All that sort of stuff. So let's see. Okay, well, I'll just say a little bit about it. Some of these, now that I have a better understanding of the paper, I'm a little bit nervous about some of what we have in the slides. Following Felipe's approach to my paper, I'll start with a very summary is maybe too strong a term, but as you can see, it's about making these efficiency comparisons between using a carbon tax and a cap and trade scheme. And the uncertainty that's going to be introduced here is this aggregate demand uncertainty. Okay, so there's that. I think everybody can see that this point is that this is a sophisticated model and very precisely done. With respect to the modeling, the carbon one is for a non-expert like myself, that seemed relatively straightforward. The cap and trade scheme brings a whole lot of complexity to the story. I say here it's connected to more than this, but it's connected to the finite horizon. So these things, you know, if you have a permit, you use it at time t. There's no future, so there's no point in saving it beyond that. And furthermore, you have to have them at time t. You have to have these permits to cover all of your emissions up to that point. So it's not like you can breach that agreement. Okay, so I think that and the price of these is endogenous, and it changes from period to period. And so this is, I think, the source of much of the complexity that arises. What do I have to say there? It's competitive. Yeah, okay, just said kind of what I just said before. So it is, as I said, it's sophisticated, and I think with respect to the cap and trade, it's pretty complex. You know, I wrote here key elements. You know, these were, as I read the paper, these were things that caught my eye going through it. The first is this idea that, well, you have to obey the law. The carbon tax has a law that you obey on a period by period basis. You pay your taxes. The cap and trade has this legal constraint that you only have to obey in the final period. And you know, I recognize that captures something about the real world. What I see is, I mean, one issue would be, well, what if that were not the case, right? What if we considered the case where the cap and trade folks have to settle up on a period by period basis instead of on the compliance? I think you called it a compliance period, Felipe. So that's just one issue that comes up. Changing output, you'll recall, is costly. And therefore, the demand shocks generate efficiency costs. If you know exactly what was coming, then you wouldn't have to worry about changing your output, but you'll have to change your output because demand is changing around, just kind of bringing that to the attention of others. I know Felipe knows that, and perhaps I even got it slightly wrong. There's the capacity constraints in each period. I think that okay, well, you saw how that could get in. There's some stuff that kind of goes unspoken. There's risk neutrality, there's exponential discounting, and then there's the use of the expectations operator with respect to things like the expected present value of profits for firms. I said, you know, rational, I threw in there for expectations, meaning they're right about their expectation in an objective sense. I take it that's what's going on there. These are not, I don't find these like problematic, but they were sort of implicit, I guess. All right. So what did strike me as I read this? And again, I am a naive reader. But an equilibrium would exist. Now, that may be that I just don't. Sorry, I got a message that said that my internet connection was unstable. So I, maybe if I was well versed in this field, I would immediately say, well, of course, we can appeal to the setup of this problem, and immediately we know that an equilibrium exists. But it certainly was not obvious to me, and I did kind of expect, after seeing this description of an equilibrium, that there would be proof of existence. I'm not like recommending that you provide that proof, Felipe, but you might want to draw in non-experts a little bit by making it clear that there's good reason to think that such a thing exists. And I was worried about the simulation because I thought it was going to be hard to solve. That was part of the not knowing if an equilibrium exists. But I thought this is going to, anyway, you're the expert. You think it's tractable, but boy, even it's not analytically tractable in some sense. But in a simulation, it may well be tractable. But even that looked to me like a big question. Anyway, that might be more about my limitations than about yours. But because of that, I did. I have one suggestion, which is probably probably your best response would be to ignore. But I was drawn to it by thinking actually about Martin Weitzman. The paper, as Felipe pointed out, he starts by referencing prices and quantities. I had something else in mind, but I think it was characteristic of Weitzman's work in some sense. One of my favorite theory papers of all time was written by Weitzman. It was a paper called Optimal Search Among Alternatives in Econometrica in, I don't know, late 70s or something. Anyway, he started that problem off. It was pretty sophisticated at the time with respect to the techniques involved. He started that paper off. If you read it, you would probably remember it as the Pandora's box paper. He starts it off with an example where it's optimal search among alternatives, and the question is, are you going to choose there's two like investment projects. One is box A, the other is box B, and that there's two possible outcomes essentially of how valuable these are, but you don't know that. And to search it means you're going to pick one and you're going to learn how valuable it is, and then if you want to, you pick the other one to search, or you stop your search after one and either say, okay, I'm going to go with one or two, right? So anyway, that was the setup, and he starts this, as I said, pretty complex thing off with this incredibly simple problem that is, do you stop? And the answer that you get in terms of what is optimal in that particular example, it was highly counterintuitive. Most of the ways we would compare these two investment projects would favor, the second box, but in fact, it makes more sense to search the first box first. Anyway, that was something I saw. I associate with the work of Weitzman, this idea of having easy examples, and I was trying to think maybe an easy example would make this paper more accessible and possibly more tractable. So this is my suggestion, a very simple illustrative example. But when I have a very simple illustrative example, I have something very simple. I have two firms, two periods, two potential outcomes for demand each period, and only one type of plant per firm. I know that matters later on, but so we're getting rid of a lot of the complexity here, and basically I want to see an answer to that simple question before we worry about all this other stuff. I think it would allow me to judge the rest of the paper if I could sort of see that. So I know that there'd be issues about trying to come up with these competitive prices for permits. I think that's a very difficult problem, I would say. But Felipe is the expert there. Given what you had to tell me today, there is the question about there are alternative ways to measure the shock. I just said have two potential outcomes. You chose a Markov route. I guess the idea there is that it does mean that today's demand gives you information about next period's demand. So it's not like you're drawing independent. It's not like you have some sort of fixed level of demand and independent shocks each period. Might be interesting to say exactly what that role is. Like, what if you did replace that with independent shocks each period? Does that mean that the efficiency problem goes away and we have equivalency? The ramping costs are in there. I guess I'll ask you, Felipe. I guess I have a question or two on the next page. So this is one I already asked now. What if you had to pay period by period? Would you still have any efficiency difference in that case? And then an actual real life question, because I could easily imagine a situation where somebody gets to period T, they don't have enough permits, they try to buy them, the price is really high, and they say, you know what, we're gonna see what happens. Okay, and that's the thank you. What was the I had this other so the question that I had is, it kind of looks to me, and I know this is intuitive and misses a lot of what's going on here, but it kind of looks to me that like the cap and trade is almost a more constrained version of the problem than what you get with, I know that that's not precise, but it's almost more constrained. That is, I'm having a hard time seeing how cap and trade can actually be ex ante more efficient here than the carbon tax. But maybe that's not a problem for you. Anyway, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so Leon, how much time do we have for a brief discussion here?
9 minutes.
Excuse me?
9 minutes.
9 minutes. Okay.
Lots of time.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna be very brief either way. So let me, if you could leave those questions there, Jim. I mean, it was. Otherwise, I'll just forget them as I elaborate a bit. Yeah, I just forgot the first question that you had in that last slide. Yeah. So basically, what you're asking on the first bullet point is what happens if the firm had to surrender permits on a period by period basis instead of surrendering them at the expiration date of the compliance period. That's your concern. So I mean, to be honest, that's from a theoretical point of view. I mean, I could do this. I could do that. Actually, my analytical framework allows that. You could, for example, set cap T equal to 1, and then have multiple versions of the model, like sort of you playing a game with the same matrix payoff in each stage of the game, right? So that would pretty much be the case you're thinking on from an analytical point of view, where you surrender permits in each period, right? Now, the reason I'm not doing it, it's because when I take it to the simulation part, I want these periods to be hourly periods. You see, I want these periods to be hourly periods. And if you think, so it just makes no sense to think about firms having to buy permits on an hourly basis, right? That would, and you don't want that. You don't want that when you think about designing permit systems in general, quantity-based approaches to emissions. Let that be carbon emissions, let that be NOx or sulfur oxide, whatever. You want to allow the firms a sufficiently long compliance period in order to mitigate price volatility in allowances, basically. You see, if you think about the California cap and trade market, for example, which is currently the cap and trade system that covers the broadest scope of anthropogenic carbon sources, they have compliance periods of 3 years, you see? So firms, they are required to surrender their allowances, 2 years. They are required to surrender allowance in order to cover all emissions generated throughout 2 years. That's it. There are analytical reasons why me thinking of a setup where firms need to surrender on a period by period basis would increase volatility in emissions prices so much that they would be very detrimental from an efficiency standpoint, right? Because these prices are uncertain at the end of the day. So that's related to your first question. You said also something about the simulation not being tractable, at least analytically tractable. Let me just say there that I said that the model is tractable, and it is analytically tractable because you can take first order conditions, you can compute the Euler conditions of the model, and basically assess the firm's decision both at the extensive margin, which is whether to have power plants operating or not, and at the intensive margin as well, which is how much to produce at each available power unit. You see, you can see what's the marginal expected payoff of producing an additional unit of output versus what would be the environmental cost to the firm under the specific policy, if you're thinking about a policy setup, or under the business usual setup, which in that case would be zero. The fact that you can characterize these Euler conditions, and the fact that you can, instead of solving the model, simply code this system of Euler conditions and solve that as an alternative to solving the problem, which fully characterizes the firm's profit maximization problem, is what I mean with the model being analytically tractable. Okay. Let's see other questions. They say, in real life, what happens if you fail to hand over enough permits? I know there are big fines. There are very, very big fines for you not complying, which could even end up in business closures. And I mean, these cap and trade programs have been functioning since the early 2000s. So and firms comply. I mean, you can look at the data, and there's data, at least for the California cap and trade system, there's data at the firm level with how much allowances they buy, how much allowances they surrender, and when they surrender them. Okay, so overall, I wouldn't believe there will be a problem with that from the point of view of legal firms going around the legal requirements. But yeah, I mean, the thing that you need to keep in mind here also with something that you said, that the cap and trade is more constrained relative to the carbon tax scenario, is that that's actually not the case, because under a cap and trade you have flexible prices. The prices will adjust to the demand shocks, right? The emissions prices will adjust to the demand shocks. So that gives the firm more flexibility to basically allocate emissions and output throughout time. Meanwhile, in the case of a carbon tax, the per unit price of emissions, which is the per unit carbon tax, is exogenously determined. So the firm needs to basically make more adjustment on the production side in order to adjust to these demand shocks that are period by period. Okay, so yeah, I believe that's pretty much what I'm going to say about this. Thanks a lot, Jim, for the feedback and comments. I highly appreciate them.
Thank you. Other comments or questions about the paper? We have about 2 minutes. If not, then Ines, you're next.
Okay, let me share my screen. Okay. Can you see the presentation? Okay, so hello, my name is Nunes. I am a PhD candidate at the Center for Management Studies at the Instituto Superior Técnico in Lisbon University. The paper I'm going to present today is Climate Policy Effective in Reducing Greenhouse Gas Emissions, the Effects of Environmental Policy and Technology Transfer in Portugal. Okay, so regarding the agenda for this presentation, I will start with the introduction, followed by the empirical methodology and the results. Then I will provide you some of the main conclusions and some prospects of future work. So I would like to start by the concept of a green paradox. A green paradox is when climate policies that were designed to reduce emissions backfire and end up having the opposite effect. So what happens in a green paradox is that if fossil fuel producers anticipate future stringency of environmental policy or a declining price of a substitute fuel, either because of increasing subsidies or because of technological improvement, for instance, This will threaten to decrease their future scarcity rents. Fossil fuels are exhaustible non-renewable resources, and so their prices reflect this scarcity. So as a result, producers decide to extract less in the future and more today instead, in order to maximize their profits. The concentration of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere depends on extraction, and so if this extraction is accelerated or more concentrated towards the present, instead of being distributed over longer periods of time, this of course takes a negative toll on the environment, and these environmental policies end up increasing emissions. So having this concept in mind, our paper has the following research questions. The first question is environmental policy leading to lower greenhouse gas emissions in Portugal, or is there a green paradox in which more feed-in tariffs and less fossil fuel support lead to higher emissions? In our case, our environmental policy variables for now are feed-in tariffs and fossil fuel support. And then we have a secondary question, which is, what is the impact of technology transfer on greenhouse gas emissions evolution? According to our results, it seems that environmental policy is indeed effective, meaning that there is no green paradox in Portugal. However, technology transfer seems to be contributing to the increase of the emissions in the country, which can be seen as a green paradox, one that is not related with environmental policy, but related with the diffusion of technologies instead. So I would like to give you a brief overview of the country. So as many European countries, Portugal is in the quest for the decarbonization of the energy system. In terms of policies, the country implemented feed-in tariffs, and we can see here in the first picture the evolution. Feed-in tariffs are an effective and cost-efficient policy instrument for promoting electricity generation from renewable sources. The tariff acts as an incentive that compensates the higher costs of renewable energy compared to conventional fossil fuel energy production. However, and somehow counterintuitively, when we look here for picture 2, we see that the country has also generally increased the support for fossil fuels. This fossil fuel support, this variable here, it represents the revenues foregone in favor of fossil fuels as a result of tax system features. Nevertheless, the electricity generated in the country comes mostly from renewable energy sources. We can see here in figure 3, the energy mix for the country in January 2021, in which more than 70% of electricity generated was green, with a predominance of hydropower and wind energy. And finally, looking for picture 4, we can see the evolution of greenhouse gas emissions over the last 18 years. Now, regarding the empirical methodology, first we tested for the stationarity of the time series, and we also performed causality and co-integration tests. In order to assess the presence or not of a green paradox, an ordinary least squares model was employed to describe the relationship between greenhouse gas emissions, our dependent variable, and the set of independent variables that I will talk in the next slides. Data spans 19 years from 2000 to 2018. In this table, we have the variables used in the regression. As I said previously, the dependent variable is the total emissions of greenhouse gases. In terms of environmental policy, we have these two variables, so feed-in tariffs and fossil fuel support. Feed-in tariffs, again, represent the increased incentive of the government to deploy renewable energy sources, and the main policy instrument applied in Portugal to promote electricity generation from renewables. This variable contains feed-in tariffs. It is the mean value of feed-in tariffs for the following technologies: solar PV, wind, small hydro, biomass, waste, geothermal, and marine. Then we have the fossil fuel support variable, also included as a policy variable, representing, again, the waiving of taxes in favor of fossil fuels. And of course, this can be regarded as an anti-climate measure. Then we use international trade as a proxy for technological transfer. and we use precipitation as a proxy for weather conditions. And recalling the energy mix that we saw a few slides ago, hydropower represents a significant portion of renewables in generation in Portugal. So there is this importance of controlling for weather conditions, mainly precipitation. Additionally, our model also controls for the quantity of electricity generated with two variables. So we account for energy consumption and electricity price for industrial users. Regarding the results of the tests, unit root tests reveal that all variables are integrated of first order, except for feed-in tariffs and precipitation, which are stationary at level. For this reason, all the other variables, except these two, except feed-in tariffs and precipitation, we calculated the first differences and are the first differences that we use in the regression. Regarding the Granger causality tests, they show that there is no causality between the variables, which indicates that a contemporaneous approach may be adequate. And for this reason, we do not apply lags in our variables. Then the results of the Engel-Granger cointegration test point towards the non-existence of a long-run relationship between the variables, and this is in line with the literature that states that if a green paradox occurs, it is only in the short run. And here we have the regression results. So regarding the first variable, feed-in tariffs, we see that there is a negative relationship between this variable and the dependent one. And so environmental policy seems to be effective. This means that if we increase the mean value of feed-in tariffs, it is expected that greenhouse gas emissions will decrease. And recall that the green paradox hypothesis states that if producers predict more policy stringency, and in this case, policy stringency would be the increase of feed-in tariffs, because by increasing feed-in tariffs, they are subsidizing renewables. So the prices of this substitute fuel, for instance, for oil, would decrease, and this would be considered environmental policy. And so we see that from the feed-in tariffs perspective, environmental policy is effective and there is no green paradox. Then regarding the second policy variable, fossil fuel support, we see that there seems to be a positive relationship with emissions. So if, for instance, fossil fuel support decreases, which would represent more environmental policy stringency, it is expected that greenhouse gas emissions would also decrease. So once again, this contradicts the green paradox hypothesis. Recall that if the producer anticipates future policy stringency, for instance, less fossil fuel support, it would start to extract more fossil fuels in the present, which would increase emissions, but that's not the case. However, we see that technology transfer, here represented by trade, seems to have a positive relationship with the evolution of greenhouse gas emissions. This means that the transfer and implementation of technology may trigger a rebound effect in the sense that it increases emissions. This can be regarded as a different green paradox, one that is not related with environmental policy, but with the diffusion of technologies instead. Then we see a positive relationship between energy consumption and the dependent variable, meaning that an increase in energy consumption must be met by an increase in electricity generation, which of course will accelerate the emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. Concerning the electricity prices and the emissions, there also seems to be a positive relationship, which could be expected since higher prices of electricity are usually associated with an expansion in demands for electricity. And finally, and somehow also expected, given the predominance of hydropower in the country, there seems to be a negative relationship between precipitation and greenhouse gas emissions. So in terms of conclusions, the contributions of feed-in tariffs for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in the country is clear. This means that in order to achieve higher decarbonization targets, the value of these tariffs should consistently increase in order to generate more renewables capacity and of course ultimately reduce emissions. Yet in the last years, the tariffs have been consistently decreasing in Portugal up to the point where they were cancelled. In addition, we see that the support for fossil fuels should decrease since this variable, the variable fossil fuel support, it is a significant variable, and of course it's conflicting with measures intended to reduce emissions. Overall, the paper provides evidence that there is no green paradox in the country. Regarding the second question, we see that technology transfer seems to have a positive relationship with the evolution of greenhouse gas emissions. This adverse outcome has important policy implications, as increases in trade should be cautiously paired up with environmental policy, and technology transfer policies should be designed accounting for the undesirable effect that technology transfer may have on greenhouse gas emissions. Finally, and although this is not the focus of the paper, we see that energy consumption arises as one of the main drivers of greenhouse gas emissions. This means that all measures regarding energy efficiency and consumption management should also be policy concerns. Right. Okay, so in terms of future work, this is still a work in progress, and this is a very preliminary version of the paper. So any kind of feedback and suggestions will be very appreciated. At this point, we have some short-term objectives, and we would like to test other variables, especially variables for policy, not necessarily environmental policy, but also other proxies for technology transfer besides trade, and also other weather variables. And I'm going to stop here. So thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward for your questions and suggestions.
Thank you.
Yeah, closed. Thank you.
I like the paper a lot, especially for the clarity of the writing and the clarity of the research question. Just some suggestions. I did not find a formal test of the green paradox. So should I reject the green paradox if both coefficients are not supporting it, or do I reject the green paradox if one of the two coefficients is consistent with that? I realize that you found that the coefficients on fit and the fossil fuel support were both inconsistent with the green paradox. I just wondered what the formal test might be. And then, do I understand this correctly? That basically the paradox says that if I cannot sell coal tomorrow, I'm going to sell it today. So in that case, why not choose a forward operator as a proxy for expectations of what will happen in the next period? In other words, would it be profitable to address emissions at time T on the expectation that climate policy will tighten in the next period? But just a suggestion.
Okay, can you show, sorry. I thought it was over.
And then finally, you have an ingenious use of the openness share of GDP as indicating technology transfer. But another possibility perhaps is that the rise in the trade share of GDP is a proxy for an increase in average domestic income, or just domestic income. Since a higher income will increase imports and therefore the openness variable. And that's about it for me. I have other comments, but I will email them to you. Questions, comments, go ahead.
Okay, so can you show me like the first slide of questions so I can follow. Yeah. Okay, so can you provide a formal test? At this point, we are only testing the effects of the policies on total emissions. So that's how we are measuring the green paradox. So to your question, do we reject the paradox if the three coefficient signs are incorrect? Yes, at this point, yes. That is why we would like to find other policy variables so we can make sure that this is a robust conclusion. So that would be, can you show me the next slide, please? Yes, so that's a point taken. It is a good suggestion to use a forward operator. As you say in the next slide, the problem is that we are dealing with 18 years. So once we start applying forward operators, we start losing observations. So it is a good point. At this point, we are also considering maybe some panel analysis, something that will increase our observations, so we can try to adjust lags and test other hypotheses. Yeah.
It sounds like a good idea.
Yeah. And the next slide. Point. Yeah. So at this point, we are using trades, which might not be the best indicator of technology transfer because there are other things, of course, included in trade. As you say, maybe the domestic income as reason, which of course would increase imports. And again, the model is not co-integrated, indicating omitted variables. So that's why we are at this point looking for different types of variables so we can make a better model of the variables we have and trying to make other tests. Emission, so residual underestimates greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah. And sorry.
Go ahead.
No, and I'm just wondering because we do use total greenhouse gas emissions, but maybe it would also make sense to see greenhouse gas emissions for different sectors, for instance, for transport or for other, yeah,
yes,
because
that's a good idea. Yeah, you would get more observations. I enjoyed reading the paper. It's a very good paper. I learned from it.
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions or comments for Inés?
Hi, Inés. I just have a very quick question.
Yes.
I don't know, perhaps you said it, I didn't fully get it, so I would like you to elaborate a little bit more on this. You said that you found evidence that on the short run, in response to the policy, these greenhouse gas emissions increase, but in the long run they decrease. I don't know if I'm right with that. But I mean, I would just like you to elaborate more on what are the economic mechanisms driving this result, right? And I'm also asking you this connected to Leon's feedback of possible omitted variables. To the extent that you have a theory that supports your empirical findings, that would help you a lot to bulletproof your paper against possible concerns of people saying, hey, you know what, you may have here some omitted variable that you're still missing, right? But now having the theory would make you come across much more convincingly, right? So I would like you perhaps to elaborate on what's the mechanism driving that result.
Okay, so starting with your first point, the thing is, when we did the co-integration tests, they showed that there is no long-run relationship between the variables. So this means that if a green paradox occur, and this was before doing the regression, it would only be on the short run. So it would not be in the long run. So at that point, we exclude the idea of green paradox for the long run and focus on the short run. And then what we see with the regression is that there is no green paradox. So if we increase policy, in this case, in policy stringency, then emissions will decrease. So this will contradict the green paradox hypothesis. I don't know if that makes it clear.
Yeah.
Yeah. So following your second point and the omitted variables, The thing is, we have mostly studies regarding green paradox are for fossil fuel producer countries that are coal producers, oil producers. And of course, Portugal is not perceived as a fossil fuel producer. It does produce some fossil fuel, but not as significantly as other countries. So we are trying to apply this methodology to countries that are not defined as fossil fuel producers. So regarding your bullet points on or even the literature, we do see some literature that there might occur a green paradox. Some contradict this literature. Others agree with it. But we are just trying to test the applicability of countries that might not be perceived as fossil fuel producers, especially Southern European countries. That would also be our idea moving on to a panel. I don't know if that's what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, kind of. I mean, like, because I understand what you're saying, but some people may not be super clear on why we should be observing a green paradox, you know, for the case of Portugal, right? Or for, I mean, for a specific scenario. So I mean, I'm not saying this is what I got from you. I'm just, you know, I'm just elaborating the example, right? If there were no particular reason for me to expect a green paradox in the data for a specific sense, then I believe that could potentially be detrimental to your econometric exercise, right? Like, so I believe it would be very nice if you could, for example, make the case that if you could make the case, you know, it's very possible that we could see, given, you know, these trends in these variables of the data, a green paradox with these types of policies for this place. And there's no literature on this, so I'm gonna conduct an empirical study where I assess that, you know, but first making that case so that people are on the hook, and then you say, you know what, that's actually not the case. I believe that would make your paper potentially very interesting, right? That's the reason why I was asking.
Changing a little bit the motivation. Is that what you're trying to tell me?
Based on a bit of based on an economic mechanism that would, you know, convince people, a wide audience, of why we could expect a green paradox and what does that mean, and then coming across with that theory and with, you know, a robust connection to the data of why that is not the case. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Felipe. Yeah.
Other questions or comments for Inez? Okay, if not, I will end the session. My thanks for 3 outstanding presentations.